Alright guys, welcome to today's video. In this one I'm going to be speaking about how to prepare your physical body to perform high-level acrobatic martial arts techniques, or what is often referred to as tricking. But whether or not you're already experienced in tricking, a lot of these modalities will still be very beneficial for you to incorporate. Now, in my overwhelming experience, people always want to just jump to the flashy techniques, but I've never really seen anybody speak about how to actually go about preparing your body to be able to be even capable of that in the first place. So some of the things in this video might seem quite meta, but there's a lot of things that I've never really seen spoken about in the context of tricking. So I'm hoping it's going to give you some different things to consider. Now, in preparing this video, I realized there was just a massive amount of information that I could have included. So this video is going to be more like a general overview of a few different modalities that can really help you. But depending on the reception of the video, if people are super interested in this topic, I'm more than open to creating more in-depth videos on each of these individual elements. So if that's something you might be interested in, please just leave me a comment below and let me know, and I'll look into doing that as well. So tricking is an acrobatic form of martial arts expression that formed as an amalgamation of various other disciplines and traditional martial arts styles. Some of those include taekwondo, capoeira, wushu, gymnastics, and there's also some breakdancing in there as well. It started to gain traction on the North American Sport Karate Association, or NASKA circuit, in the extreme forms divisions, where competitors further advanced the discipline by inventing more flamboyant and difficult tricks to outcompete each other. It then branched out and became further developed in the backyard and tricking gathering circles to what we see today. Although the term tricking is kind of like a blanket statement for the discipline as a whole, there are various other kind of subcategories that fall under that umbrella term as well, such as kickers, twisters, and so on. In the early days of tricking, there was certainly a sense of hostility between these two major groups who were both practicing at the same time, and those were people that had a traditional martial arts background and those who didn't. The people who had the more traditional martial arts background would focus upon a kind of smaller subset of tricks and focusing upon getting them really clean and polished, and the other group who hadn't got that background would focus more upon power moves and progressing that way. And I've been training in martial arts a few years before I discovered tricking, so naturally I gravitated more towards the martial arts style techniques. And that was largely due to the movies and other influences I'd been exposed to, and that eventually led me to discover tricking as its own entity as well. So with that being said, many of the things I'm going to address in this video are focused upon more of that martial arts style of tricking. However, if you're a kick-centered tricker or a twister, it doesn't really matter because there's a lot of overlap and many of the general principles are the same. And you're also going to be using a lot of the same techniques anyway, such as executing a powerful spin hook kick to transition into combinations, for instance. So with that brief history out of the way, firstly, as I always speak about, the bulk of physical development will manifest through simply training in the activity. This is how I've developed my martial arts skills, through constantly repeating the movements. However, despite that, my philosophy is always, why not implement some of these components on top of that to give you that force multiplying effect? Now, the first thing that's important to address before anything else are the main muscle groups that are going to be utilized in tricking. And the reason this is so important to focus on is because if you lack strength and stability in certain areas, regardless of any other training that you've done, you're going to run into limitations fairly quickly as soon as you start practicing higher level techniques. So for instance, if you have weakness in a certain area, then it may be applicable for you to add on some extracurricular strength training to make even attempting the higher level techniques make sense at all. I see this loads in basic martial arts training as a whole, where people see these flashy and flamboyant techniques without really addressing the fact that the vehicle for performing these techniques, which is their physical body, is in a very suboptimal state to begin with. So the key muscles used in tricking are the core, including the obliques, the lats, and all of the muscles of the legs, particularly the quads and glutes for jumping. The core muscles are vital in all aspects of tricking, but particularly in terms of stability as well as creating torque in twisting. If there's weakness and instability in the core as a starting point, then it's going to create what I call energy leakages, which basically means where the general energy potential that you create going into a technique is going to be kind of discharged and wasted mid-movement. Hence, having strength in this area is of vital importance. To develop strength in the core for tricking, the best type of exercises I've come across are gymnastic hollow body training exercises. So these include things like V-ups and hollow body holds. Seeing as gymnastics is so closely related to tricking, this makes a lot of sense. This training is relatively difficult and you'll have to build up to higher repetition amounts, but any of these that you do with relatively good form will definitely strengthen your body. These exercises will also train the often overlooked oblique muscles, which are really important in kicking prowess, which enable you to essentially stand up nice and tall when you're kicking rather than hunching over and looking all stiff. So obviously that is going to result in a much nicer looking kick at the end. I think it goes without saying the importance of the leg muscles in tricking, and strength in this area can be developed in a vast number of ways. You can do traditional weight training like squats for instance, and while this will improve your jumping height, I've personally also seen it negatively impact other attributes of certain trickers such as their mobility and overall agility, so choose wisely. What I prefer are these plyometric jumping drills. The reason for this is that these movements are much more closely related to tricking as an activity, being explosive and fast, and so are much more applicable than slow compound movements. With these, I'd recommend performing 10 reps of each exercise with a 15-second rest in between before moving on to the next one. And you'll definitely know you're performing these correctly because you'll certainly feel it after performing a couple of sets. Obviously, flexibility plays a vital role in the overall aesthetic of certain tricking techniques, as well as going towards mobility, recovery and injury prevention. Personally, due to having good flexibility before tricking through my martial arts training, I luckily never gained any flexibility related injuries when practicing, whereas some of my less flexible peers did suffer with these. So it goes without saying that a good flexibility regime is vital, and a common misconception I've observed is that flexibility in the legs is the only necessary element for tricking, but there's also a lot of other considerations to take into account, such as flexibility of the lower back for instance, to create a dynamic looking flash kick. The type of stretching I'd recommend in order to see the fastest progression is PNF stretching, done every other day, and also perhaps a little bit of yoga to create freedom in other areas of the body as well. I personally like to do only dynamic stretching before I do any training, and I warm up the whole body like this and then perform sets of 10 to 12 dynamic leg swings, front, rear and side. Before we get into any of the actual tricking techniques themselves, it's really important for us to talk about basic kicks. The basic kicks are the front kick, turning or roundhouse kick, hook kick, inside and outside crescent kicks, spin hook kick, and potentially a low sweep as a bonus. This selection of techniques covers the majority of different planes of motion and hip positioning that form the foundation for aesthetic and clean tricking techniques, especially the kicking ones. I would heavily suggest including some practice of these basic kicking techniques to form a nice foundation for harder level tricking moves, and I would say it's also a non-negotiable if you wish to develop that kick-centric martial arts tricking style. If you can't do a turning kick that looks like this when you're static on the ground, then you're never going to make a cheat 900 look like this. And whether you're looking to make your kicks super clean or just use them as a means to an end, they need to be effective in gaining momentum, and generally the more efficient a technique is, the more effective it is. In this context, the best way I could describe this is that you want those basic kicks to look like they could do real damage. You want them to look devastating basically. You can do this by setting aside some time at the beginning of a session in order to train these kicks, which is done just through repetitions with correct technique. And this also acts as a good warm-up and activates the correct muscle groups for the higher level techniques afterwards. I would recommend Taekwondo style line kicking as the best method to do this, where you simply move forward, repeating the technique one leg after another. In order to get your techniques to look as clean as possible, ensure that you're paying attention to the chamber, extension and rechamber, the three main points of a kicking technique, as well as pointing your toes, which makes the limb look longer and sharper. In thinking of this, I like to visualize a samurai unsheathing his blade, cutting through a target and then sheathing it again immediately, all performed at lightning speed. As a bonus, I'd also recommend training some of these kicks against a target like a kick shield or a heavy bag, something with a good bit of resistance to it, which will develop positioning, power and aggression that is going to make those tricking techniques look much nicer afterwards. It's a general consensus that there are a few basic tricking moves across all of the different styles, so flipping, kicking and twisting, that generally cover all of those different planes of motion. And it's a good idea to be proficient in all of these, whether you're focused upon one discipline or another, because as you get more advanced, there's always going to be overlap in these techniques, so you don't want to run into those limitations because you're super weak in one of the areas. So for instance, the B-twist is considered as a twisting technique at its base level, however it can then also become a kicking technique if you throw a roundhouse kick on the end of it. In the kicking category, the first few moves to learn would be the tornado kick, which progresses to the 540, pop 360, and I would also add a jump front kick in there, as it can look really nice when added onto higher level tricks. The kicking techniques are pretty safe to train straight off the bat as long as you have a decent level of bodily awareness. The flip category contains back tuck, aerial, and I'd also add gainer in there as well, as it's relatively easy once you're comfortable at flipping and can help with developing the flash kick. Finally, the twisting category contains the butterfly kick, progressing into the butterfly twist. There are loads of add-ons and variations as well that are really beyond the scope of this video, but the ones I just listed then are a good baseline to get you started. There's numerous ways and locations to train your tricking moves, and I'm personally from a really small town with not much going on, so when I started there were hardly any options available, so I just had to train in my garden or in a field with the occasional use of an old mattress as a crash mat. And this is how a lot of people do it. So if you're from a larger town or city, then it's likely there'll be some sort of gymnastics facility with a sprung floor, which would be optimal, or at least somewhere with a matted floor where you can be a little bit safer. One thing I did, which I believe was absolutely invaluable, was studying footage of those people I wanted to move like early, which meant viewing videos frame by frame in order to study things like how they executed their takeoff, where their hands were positioned, where they extended their kick, and so on. On top of that, filming yourself training and attempting some of these moves is one of the most valuable hacks that you can utilize in your tricking journey. And the reason for this is that often when you execute a move, for instance, it might feel really good when you're doing it, but then when you look back at that footage, it might not look as good as it felt. So it's really important to assess how you're actually moving so that you can progress accurately. Aside to all that though, at its bare bones, really all it is about attempting the moves again and again and again and falling on your ass time after time until you manage to land them. So it takes a certain type of persistence in order to progress in tricking. You have to constantly remind yourself, you know, this is a process, it's something you're learning, and you're going to fall a lot, it's just part of that process. That doesn't mean being reckless though, it doesn't mean just going out there and throwing yourself into movements, which is going to increase your risk of injury massively. You need to strike a nice balance in which you have enough level of intent behind your movements to actually progress, because if you're too timid, your body's not going to receive enough stimulus to learn how the move should actually feel. The kicking techniques are by far the safest to practice, and for flipping techniques like back tuck, you can use a spotter and a crash mat, which is somebody to help spin you around in midair. Obviously, the safest and most optimal place to train these moves would be in a gymnastics facility with a sprung floor and a foam pit, and that also aids in easing a lot of the mental turmoil associated with flipping over backwards as a beginner. But I learned back tuck on grass with a friend spotting me, so don't let the lack of facilities be an excuse. Now, you could be training in the most well-equipped facility in the world, but then that's still not going to get around the fact that you have to just attempt these moves again and again and fall a lot. And if you experience discouragement and resistance in this process, don't worry about it. It's natural. As I said, it's all part of the learning experience. Psychologically, this is going to be more challenging as an adult because of the tendency to become somewhat jaded towards life as we get older. Meaning the more frequently you've been thinking in a certain way, it's actually easier to continue to think that way, as the brain tends to habituate certain thinking patterns in an attempt to save time. Now, this is supposed to be something useful for us, and it generally is, but it can also quickly become maladaptive if the mind gravitates more towards a fixed mindset. Think about a toddler learning to walk, for instance. They're fresh into the world and generally free of any conditioning, and they pay no attention to the thousands of times they fall down when attempting to take their first steps and let it degrade their self-image, as the majority of adults do. Adopt the mindset of that child learning to walk and just simply make a decision that I will land this move no matter how much work it takes, and see any failure as simply data showing you where you went wrong and how you can improve better next time. If you are struggling mentally sometimes, don't try and force yourself, because you're just going to be resisting this further and energizing that negative situation. Simply take some time off if this is happening and do something like perhaps watch some videos of trickers who inspire you, and it will generally bring you into a much greater headspace and light that fire of inspiration once again. The main thing is that you're having fun. It's definitely not a race to the top where the training just feels like a means to an end, and a happy athlete is generally a well-performing athlete. As a bonus section here, I wanted to include a little bit of information regarding a nutritional approach to tricking. Now, there's obvious things like making sure you're consuming enough calories in order to match the energy expenditure of the activity, but there's also a lot more to the equation than that. Something that I very rarely see addressed in nutrition talks about all kinds of training is actually the effect that the certain foods that you're eating have upon the body once they're consumed. There's a lot more to the equation than simple energy expenditure, but one of the major things that relates directly to tricking is the level of inflammation occurring in the body when heavily processed foods are consumed. When I say the word inflammation, I don't mean that your legs are going to suddenly become red and swollen if you eat a pizza. I'm talking about inflammation on a microscopic level, which can be experienced as aches and joint pains, and often people just kind of think that this is a natural part of the process and they're achy from training. The reason I've included this as a bonus section is that it's not going to be as much of a detracting factor as, say, having a very weak core is, for example. But the way I like to approach my training and physicality in general is to be like a well-oiled machine, to be as optimal as possible. Often we can be chronically operating in a suboptimal state and not even be aware of it, just because it's been happening for so long. You might be able to perform high-level tricks by eating pizza and ice cream, for instance, and not realize that you actually could feel so much better if you ditch those process and inflammation causing foods. So if you're able to do it with eating that suboptimal diet, what would it be like if you ate something much more beneficial? Approach it with the mentality of why not just do everything absolutely within your power in order to increase your chances of improvement. Personally, I've recently made some changes in my own diet, and I can absolutely say without a doubt that everything I do now feels much more effortless, especially things like high kicking. It's almost like my body feels less hindered and generally more free. So I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. There was so much I could have spoken about here. As I mentioned, I could have included so much more and I had to actually take other things out of the video. But if you are interested in more on this topic, please leave a comment below and let me know, and I'll look into making more videos like this in the future. Thank you very much for watching. As always, please subscribe and follow me on social media at Grant Stevens MA, and I will see you in the next video.